If you love to travel, you love cool experiences, I think you're going to love Viator. If you haven't heard, Viator is the world's leading travel experience marketplace. They've got everything from simple tours to extreme adventures, all the cool and interesting stuff in between as well. Well, this year, my wife and kids are making one of my bucket list trips come true. We're going to Sun Valley. So we're going to fly to Sun Valley, and I tell you, the thought of bringing skis, poles, boots, snowboards, everything overwhelming. But that's where Viator came in. They made this incredibly easy. I just opened the Viator app, searched Sun Valley, and boom, Viator arranges a first-class experience, custom ski, snowboard, and boot fittings and tickets delivered right to the condo. It's pretty amazing. Experiences are what we love most about travel. They create these long-lasting moments and make memories that will last a lifetime. Just download the Viator app now and use code Viator10 for 10% off your first booking. One app, over 300,000 experiences you'll remember. Do more with Viator.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the Wright Brothers. Of course, they took their famous flight in North Carolina on December 17, 1903. We're going to be looking at some of the events leading up to that flight. We're going to be looking at a little bit about the flight itself, and then we're going to be looking at a little bit of their later life as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started here today looking at Wilbur and Orville Wright. These are two very important inventors and pioneers of aviation in the United States. Now, Wilbur Wright, of course, he's born on April 16, 1867, near Millville, Indiana. His brother Orville is born in 1871. So Wilbur is the elder of the two brothers. Their father, a guy called Milton Wright, was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ. And he did a lot of traveling. His preaching constantly took him out and about, and as he was going around, he would bring toys back for Wilbur and Orville to play with as he traveled. I remember when I was a kid, my father would do a lot of traveling, and he sometimes would bring back little toys. And Wilbur and Orville's father did much the same thing. He often brought them back little toys. One of their favorite toys was a model helicopter, which was made of paper, and it was powered by like a rubber band type thing, and that really got Orville and Wilbur into love of flying and aeronautics and all of that kind of stuff. Wilbur, as a child, was very good in school. He was an outgoing child while he was in school, and actually had plans to attend Yale University. However, in 1885, 1886, Wilbur was injured in an ice hockey game. Following that injury, Wilbur sort of went into a deep state of depression, and he sort of canceled all his plans to go to college, and he went home and basically took care of his mother, who died of tuberculosis in 1889. That same year, Wilbur and Orville, because again, these guys are not just aeronautics people, they're inventors. They're people who want to step out and do different things and do new things. They started their own newspaper called the West Side News. The paper was edited by Wilbur, and Orville was the publisher of the paper. They opened a bike shop in 1892. They fixed bicycles. They invented their own bicycles. They sold their own inventions of bicycles. So these guys were pioneers. They were entrepreneurs. They were go-getters right out of the box. Now, as far as designing their own airplane, they were really inspired, so to speak, by a German aviator. And unfortunately, this guy dies in a glider crash. And Orville and Wilbur sort of start their own experiments, trying to sort of follow in this guy's footsteps a little bit. So Chris, talk to us about the lead up to the flight, what they were trying to do, what they were testing, how they found Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that you've giving the introduction of these individuals, it kind of shows that when we think about this flight, we talk about first in flight, but really what we find is that this was a long process. It was extremely difficult, and yes, it would be rewarded by that flight that we all know so well through the pictures and understanding what they accomplished, but how they got there is a fascinating story. You mentioned the German aviator who actually died, and that was their investment in trying to find a way that man could actually fly. And so, we basically see that in 1900, Wilbur decides that he's going to set off on the great adventure of his life, that he's leaving Dayton, Ohio, and they're going to go. And I found it interesting that they basically had ventured no far. Wilbur had never gone further than just a bicycle ride from his home in 16 years. So he wasn't used to traveling. He wasn't used to exploring. And now here were these two individuals that were going to truly show how man could fly and could explore and could travel to far places. So Wilbur set off for a place called Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which we're familiar with because it's a beautiful strand of beaches known as the Outer Banks, which are some thin chain of barrier sand islands that great destination spot for people to go if they're looking for some nice beaches with plenty of history. Of course, right next to there, Ray, you and I are familiar with the Lost Colony.
Yep.
And so we encourage our people to go to Roanoke. You can also go to Kill Devil Hills and the Kitty Hawk, where you can see what happened to the first colonist, but also what happened to the first airplane that took place, about 30 minutes from each other. Now, I found it interesting that Kitty Hawk wasn't just chosen just by flipping a coin, but a lot of research had gone into this. Wilbur had prepared for this journey with exquisite care, just like setting up a printing press or creating a bicycle with all those gears and chains and the mechanics of that. And so he had studied maps, and he had tried to find where is going to be the best place that a plane would be able to take off. And he knew, basically through American history, that the earliest chapters of American history, like we just talked about, Roanoke and things of that aspect, had taken place off the shallow waters of coastal Carolina. And of course, Giovanni de Verrazano and his crew had cruised that coast in 1524. And we had the English who had been there in Roanoke Island. And so Blackbeard, we can't forget about Blackbeard, who had also traveled up and down. And so Wilbur assured his father that the journey to Kitty Hawk was going to simply be a pleasure trip. He said, "Dad, I'm just going to go and to get a vacation." But we know that really wasn't true, because he had already loaded onto that train some parts of the glider, and he was determined that he was going to Kitty Hawk and that Wilbur Wright was going to fly. And I find it interesting that here's Wilbur, as you have said in your introduction, he was basically just ordinary, as you mentioned. And they finally had this dream that it was going to be more than just being ordinary, but they set off for a challenge. They set off for an adventure, and they knew that was going to be the adventure to go out and to fly. And so they created this machine, this 1900 glider, if you will, and they knew they couldn't fly it in Dayton. Dayton, Ohio just didn't have the winds that were going to be needed, and they were going to have to find a spot where there were going to be strong, steady winds. They needed winds about 15 to 20 miles an hour, and it had to be secluded. You needed some hills, and also, what do you need? A safe landing spot, because they were unsure of how this was going to happen. And of course, Kitty Hawk, what does it have? One of the greatest things that Wilbur said that they had was sand. So they knew that if things got bad in the air, they were going to be able to land on some sand. Now, I thought it interesting that Wilbur actually had looked at going to Chicago to fly the first plane. But what he found out is that Chicago, while it did have particular wind that was needed, it also had too much of an urban area, and then they were going to attract the attention of the press. They were going to attract a lot of people, and honestly, they didn't want people watching them if they failed. So they were looking for a secluded place, and basically they did the research, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and they found that it had everything that they needed to be able to go and to fly. So Wilbur, we talk about it being a long process to even get to the plane. So Wilbur went by himself, and his brother said, "I'm gonna take care of the bike shop while you're down there getting things set up, and I'm only going to come down to Kitty Hawk if it seems promising." And so Wilbur, he sets out, as we already mentioned, and he goes. And I found it interesting also that the journey to get to Kitty Hawk was very difficult. There were also many times when he almost turned around because they got on a boat and the boat was sinking. They lost the mast on another ship. Terrible winds. I mean, just it was a very, very bad experience. But he finally comes across and lands in September the 12th and begins to try to find where is going to be the best place that we're going to be able to take this machine or a kite and be able to fly it. Now, Ray, we were talking at one of the things, that they're going to test their theory. And so on Wednesday, October the 3rd, 1900, this is the day in which they start doing a series of tests. And they wanted the machine to kind of do this unmanned kite. And so they're testing this unmanned kite, but Wilbur gets ahead of himself, and he says, I can't stand here and just keep watching this unmanned test. I want to try to get up there and just see what happens. And so he actually gets up in 1900. So he actually gets up on October 3rd, 1900, and he goes to an altitude of about 10 feet. And the glider starts to bob up and down, and Wilbur all of a sudden starts screaming. He says, "Let me down, let me down, let me down." And so, Orville and one of the guys who were letting them stay at the house had these tethered ropes and were able to bring him down to gently back onto the sand. And Orville gave Wilbur such a difficult time about that. And he said, "I just want to know, why were you so worried when things were getting really, really interesting?" And remember, Wilbur had told his dad he was just going for a pleasure trip. And so Wilbur looked at Orville and said, "The reason I told you to let me down is because I promised Pop I'd take care of myself while I was down here." So that was in 1900, and we find out that, it's pretty dangerous, isn't it, trying to be able to fly something that's never been flown before. But what did you think about some of the testing and some of the plane and the flight that they were thinking about doing? What interests you?
Well, I think, they arrived there in Kill Devil Hills in 1900. And it's not really till 1903 that they have their big flight, so to speak, the one that actually worked. It's interesting, what interests me about it is how they really worked to design this thing. They looked at birds, for example, and the way I guess the wings on birds are shaped. They have something of an angled. They would angle their wings when they would take off, and so they really worked to make sure this thing had angled wings to some extent. And if you look at a picture of it, or if you go to Kill Devil Hills and you see I think they've got. It's been several years since I've been there, but I think they have like a model of Orville and Wilbur there, and they're laying down. Mm-hmm. Wilbur is laying down. He's not like sitting in a seat like you see, the Red Baron on Charlie Brown or something. Right. They're laying down, and they have the ability to control this thing with a rudder, to control which way it's going. So they really, they really work very hard on getting this thing right and making sure it's ready to go. And of course, as you know, on December 17, 1903, that's the big flight, right? And then that's the time they actually get off the ground for a free, controlled flight. We don't have any tethers holding this thing to the ground. This is a controlled flight, power-driven, a plane that's actually heavier than the air. It's not just a kite. This is if you look at picture, it does have gears and stuff in it. Do you know how high they flew on that day? You talk about 10 feet in 1900. Right. In 1903. They went 852 feet.
Wow!
I mean, that's a little more than 10 feet there, but he went up for over 852 feet, and for almost a minute he was in the air there. So it was quite a successful flight there in 1903.
Especially when you think that 3 years earlier, 10 feet had caused Wilbur to panic.
To panic. Yeah.
And so now we look at the transformation that has happened in such a short time to be able to go from 10 feet to that 852. And you know what else I thought it was interesting is we think about this grand experiment, this wonderful invention, and it was so difficult. I mean, I talked about Wilbur and getting there and how hard that was, but even that they were there, remember, they were there for years, testing and training and working and fixing. And the thing that we have to think about is these were guys from Dayton, Ohio, who were traveling to North Carolina. And when they got there, I found it interesting just doing some of the research and reading some of the early reports of how they were welcomed and felt when they got there. And Orville actually said, I can tell you, I feel like a poor Arctic explorer being down here because it is difficult. The wind and just, being in a new environment is very, very hard. But he also loved Kitty Hawk. He talked about how beautiful it was. One of the things that he said I thought was interesting, he said the economics of this place were so nicely balanced before our arrival that I thought everybody here could live and yet nothing be wasted. And that our presence brought disaster to the whole arrangement. He went on and he said, we have more money than the natives. And so have been able to buy up the whole egg product of the town and about all the canned goods in the store, and I fear that some of them will suffer as a result. So not only are they trying to fly a plane that's never been done before, but they're also having to adapt to the environment in which they are in. And so you have these Ohioans who come down to North Carolina, and the locals were never completely certain as to what to make of Wilbur and Orville. Now, they were likable enough. They were good guys. I mean, they didn't act like they were high society and that they were better than anybody else. But you got to remember, you've got two guys who own a printing press and a bicycle shop who have come down to an area that is made up of down-to-earth fishermen. And those down-to-earth fishermen didn't know what to think about those boys from up north, as they would say. And when they were talking about, what are you guys doing? It's like you're surfing on the sand or something. And, they said, I just don't understand why you're trying to fly something. If God wanted us to fly, he'd give us the wings to be able to do it. And that some of these fishermen just didn't think that this was something that the Wright brothers should be trying to do.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the fishermen. After it was over, and they began to tell people here in North Carolina and back in Ohio what they had done, the response from the media was basically, fake news. Right. You guys just make this up. You guys made this up to make yourselves look good. And so, they have to really go out and prove that they did this. It wasn't good enough just to do it one time. It wasn't just good enough to build the thing and fly the thing one time. They had to be able to do this over and over and over again. So as you know, in 1908, Wilbur goes to Europe, to try to prove to people, not only did we do it, we could do it again. And in Europe, he's actually, I guess he finds people a little bit more receptive. And he goes out and he demonstrates the plane. He gives rides to journalists and other people while he's in France specifically. Now, Orville goes over a few years later. It does always seem to me when I look over the story that Orville he's sort of behind Wilbur. He lets Wilbur sort of go out on the edge first, and then once it's okay, he seems to sort of follow a little bit. And of course, eventually they're going to come back to the United States. They're going to begin to sell their airplane model, the model that they created, and sell versions of it. And they're going to come back and become wealthy businessmen that are going to have an entire company that they're going to make quite a bit of money out of.
And we think about this being this long process and this difficult process, and that it was rewarding. It's rewarding to us who are able to get on a plane today and to travel far and wide in short records of time. And we owe it all to Wilbur and Orville, but yet even back then the people didn't appreciate all that was going on. And before we end the podcast, we've got to talk about the elephant that is in the room as it relates to Wilbur and Orville, and that is that you can ride just about in any part of the state of North Carolina, and you can see the license plates, and these license plates that say first in flight. Mm-hmm. And yet you can travel up to Ohio, and when you go to Ohio, and especially to Dayton, we see that they claim first in flight. So Ray, I'll ask you, who gets the credit? North Carolina, Ohio, or do both of the states get the credit?
Well, it is interesting. There does, throughout history, I think there's been a little bit of a competition between North Carolina and Ohio. But I think nowadays, here today, I think both states sort of try to respect the others, the other's position and the other's claims. But I do find it interesting. There was a guy called Bob Peterson. He's a park ranger at the Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historical Park. And he made a quote that I really, really thought was very good. He said, in Dayton, they proved that powered flight was practical. At Kitty Hawk, they proved it was possible.
Wow.
So in other words, you give a little bit of credit to Ohio, where Orville and Wilbur were born, where they really came up with this idea. But at the same time, you give a little bit of credit to North Carolina, where they first really took this idea and made it into a reality. And of course, even once they had flown, they would go back to Ohio.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I said a few minutes ago that it seems like Wilbur's sort of the one out on the edge, mm-hmm. and Orville sort of waits for Wilbur to take the chance. It is interesting when you're thinking about who gets credit for what. Right. Wilbur always gave Orville equal credit. He never claimed, "Oh, I'm the guy, and my younger brother here, he's just a tag along." Both men took equal credit for this thing, just like I think North Carolina and Ohio can take full credit for being first in flight.
Yeah, and I think that as we wrap up, I think the one thing that we can learn from all of this is that when you look at a picture of a historic event, or when you are told that the first flight was 852 feet, 59 seconds, we've got to remember that more went into it than just that moment.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, a German man had already died in a crash, in a glider. I mean, it wasn't a mechanized flight like what Orville and Wilbur had, but you'd already seen tragedy, so to speak. So this was not without risk.
It wasn't without risk, and it wasn't without inspiration. And
mm-hmm.
and the thing that I leave from studying about Wilbur and Orville is this. What is inspiring us? What is driving us? We live in such a technological, savvy, creative field today where people are talking about STEM, and we're talking about all of these vaccines and all of these things. But it all starts with inspiration. It all starts with somebody sitting in a bicycle shop, or who comes up with an idea that says, I want to know why that guy failed and what I can do to bring about success. And then they recognize that it takes a long time. It is going to be difficult. Not everybody's going to like you. And shoot, not everybody will even care about what you did. And at the end of the day, it's not about what you did, but it's what you were able to accomplish for humanity's sake. And so when we look at that plane, and when we think about Wilbur and Orville, may it be a reminder to us, what is inspiring us today? And what can we go out and do that will help change the aspect of life? What is driving us? What is driving, individuals in Bladen County? What's driving individuals in the Outer Banks or in Ohio? Who's going to be the next Wilbur and Orville Wright? Who's going to be the next person that invents something or that creates something? All of us have it within us. There's an innate desire to make change. But we've got to be willing to go through the long, arduous process to see that change be fulfilled. Wilbur and Orville didn't really see it in their lifetime. But we have so much to give thanks for today for their inspiration.
Yeah, and every time you get on a plane, every time you're in your yard or walking down the street and you see a plane fly overhead, or you see the Air Force and the jets and everything, you could always think back to Orville and Wilbur Wright. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. If you would like to get in touch with us, ask us questions, give suggestions, we do have a Twitter page. You can look us up on Twitter, History You Didn't Know. But we also have an email, historyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter U, should know, @gmail.com. Hope to see you next time.